Hi, welcome back to the channel. Michelle, and today I want to talk about discussing difficult history with your children. So if you're new to my channel, I have an 11-year-old, a 7-year-old, and a 4-year-old. We are currently in our 3rd year of homeschooling, and history is a topic that I really try to have accurate information, real history, so bring in lots of perspectives. But when you talk about real history or difficult history, you're going to talk about a lot of things that are, like I said, difficult. And how do you navigate that with a child? I think this is a really good question. So I'm going to go over kind of the 3 main reasons I hear people say they don't often expose their children to difficult parts in history, and kind of where I fall in that, and kind of share how my journey sharing and talking and discussing the difficult parts of history with my children, how that's gone and kind of the benefits from that. So the first thing I often hear, well, I guess I should define, what do I consider difficult history? Difficult history, I think, are the parts in our history that include violence, include human suffering, include really emotional topics about discrimination and people treated differently. That's the really hard areas of history. And I think a lot of people avoid them for these reasons, which I'm going to talk about. So the first one I often hear is, my kids are too young to learn about that. And my thoughts with that is, if there's a child old enough to experience it, your child's old enough to learn about it. And I think there are very age-appropriate resources out there that help you as the educator and the parent start those discussions and where to go with them. I think that's really important. Some of the resources I've used in the past are, we're currently using Oh Freedom U.S. History, and that's the narratives not often told in United States history, because if you know anything about United States history, there's a lot of suffering and discrimination and hate in it. So it can be really a lot to take on. So I really do like Oh Freedom as a resource. We've used Curiosity Chronicles, which is more of a world perspective. We've used Mint and Bloom this past year for our social justice, the power of the people. Again, bringing in all these resources that are age appropriate to start these discussions with your children, because they are ready for them. Like I said, the Oh Freedom, we've been using this last year. We've been using the K through 2nd, which is picture-based, and then the 3rd through 7th, I believe, if that's the age range, aimed at my older one, obviously. 3rd through 7th grade, focuses on a lot of chapter books and read-alouds, and all of the chapter books are from perspectives, I'm pretty sure all of them, I can't remember every single one of them now, but most of them, if not all, are from the perspective of a child going through that historical event we're talking about. So when we're talking about, we just finished a big section on World War II, so when we were talking about Japanese internment, our read aloud was The Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet, and that was from the perspective of a Chinese American and his experience watching Japanese people being rounded up and put in these camps, and that was that child's perspective. We also read the book by George Takei, which is a graphic novel that really talked about, They Called Us Enemies, the name of us. They Called Us Enemies, the name of it. It was his perspective, his experience in an internment camp, as a Japanese internment camp, as a child. So again, I love that these resources are bringing in these stories, these actual events that happen from the perspective of a child, because whether you want to admit it or not, children lived through these horrific events. And I think it's important that my children understand that, and that I think there's some sheltering that goes with this, that parents don't want them to understand that bad things can happen to children. And I think that really does come from a place of privilege. And I know as soon as I say the word privilege, people will be like, no. But there is a place of privilege. My kids don't know what it's like to be discriminated against. My kids don't know what it's like to be a person of color, and they will never fully understand those things. So being able to bring in narratives that share that opinion, or share that thought, and that what their story is in the midst of this historical event is really, really important. Not having to talk to your kids about race is a privilege. Not having to explain to your children how to act around police officers so they don't get shot is a privilege. And I don't think a lot of people are willing to admit that. In fact, I've had many people in my comment section tell me that things like white privilege don't exist. I disagree. I think my kids very much benefit from their status and their skin color, and I'm not immune to telling my kids about that and recognizing that not everybody has the same advantages that they have. And they, of course, don't have the same advantages as other people. It's important to talk about these things with our children. So one of the books I recently read was Brainstorm, and it's about the adolescent mind and, the physical changes, the scientific changes, what's going on in there. And kids are literally mapping out their brains. And there's pruning that happens, things that aren't being used. The brain kind of is like, okay, that's too much, because there's a lot going on in there in those teenage years and early adulthood. So your brain has to get rid of some of it. So if you're not talking about these narratives in history, your children are missing the opportunity to create empathy, to create connection to these historical events. They're not just a part in a textbook. This is real people. And that's hard. It's hard to talk about that, but it's really important to talk about too. So for example, my experience, I had a public school education. So my history experience, I took, I think, every history class available in my high school. It was all in my electives. I found it really interesting. And it was only in APU's history when we read Howard Zinn that we really started getting a different perspective. But my experience is I was given that very narrow perspective of history. This is something that happened long ago. It's over now. Let's move on. That's not the case. Being able to see how things happened in the past and how they still are relevant and affecting today are really important, especially in that adolescent brain that is making those final maps of how they see the world, how they identify in the world, how they see others. It's really important to be having those conversations at a young age. And again, it's not about the gore and the violence. It's about connecting human experience to history, because that is where it's going to connect to your children here. It's not just about remembering dates and important people in history. It's about the human connection of history and what those narratives are telling us. So the next one, which leads into that, is I often hear, well, my child is too sensitive to learn about those topics. And I understand. Both my girls are very sensitive. My oldest is particularly sensitive to people upset or suffering. So I get it. And I think you need to use your best judgment when approaching a child that is more sensitive. But I also don't think you need to shy away from material because it's uncomfortable. Like I said before, when your children are able to make these connections to history, whether it be through the eyes of another child in that historical event or just discussing it, they're able to understand more fully what it's like for that experience. Again, they'll never fully understand what it was like to be alive during the Holocaust and be Jewish. They'll never understand what it was like to be a black person during slavery. But you can give them glimpses through these narratives so that they can create this context, that equality, and I think that's something that's really lacking in history, that it's easy to think of people in certain ways. And I think that's, why people in power who do really bad things want us to think less of individuals, want us to, group into our little sections, because it's easier to hate someone that you don't know or you don't identify with or you don't see them as equal as you. And that is why history is so important, because it's giving us all these stories, all these struggles of that exact thing. So we need to talk about it so our children can make that connection to what it was like, how it's affecting it now, and give them that empathy and that compassion for their fellow human beings, that they're just not reading a page in a textbook or a biography about a person. It's so much more than that. So like I said before, my kids have no experience with discrimination. I mean, my youngest maybe has felt left out at times or my youngest daughter, because of her celiac disease, but she in no way faces discrimination on a daily basis, which some groups of people do. And offering these glimpses into history to better explain that perspective so they understand, because it's very easy to think the world revolves around you, especially as a child, that your experience is the only experience. And unfortunately, I think this really ties into adults as well. People think that, well, I had a rough time and I got through it, so anybody can get through it. I understand that. But understanding that other people have certain obstacles that you don't necessarily have, being able to see that others are treated differently for certain reasons is really important. And this idea that this isn't happening to children, I think, is ridiculous. There are children experiencing this, and there are children experiencing discrimination, racism, sexism. All these things happen to children. So I think it's important that we educate our children in an age-appropriate way of how to deal with these situations. You know, there's no right age to learn about human suffering. There are people suffering at all ages, so we need to talk about that and be honest with our kids. So for example, we just finished up, like I said, we were doing World War II, so we were doing the Holocaust, and we read some, difficult text, and we watched a difficult documentary. So we read Hannah's Suitcase, which is a really good book, again, from the perspective of a child, their experience as a Jewish child going through the events of the Holocaust. And then we watched the documentary that was associated with the book as well. And it was really hard. And it was hard for my kids and it was hard for me, but that's not a bad hard. Because I want you to understand that it's okay to feel sad. And I want my children to understand that it's okay to feel sad. I feel like so much of homeschooling is we want our kids to be happy. If they're not happy and enjoying themselves, we're doing something wrong. No, when we're talking about these really difficult parts, especially in history or social justice, we're going to feel sorrow and sadness, and that's a completely normal reaction to talking and discussing and learning about human suffering. And I think people shy away from it because they don't want to talk about that. It makes us as adults feel really uncomfortable sometimes, and I totally get that. We for years talked about social justice issues in my house, and I think a lot of parents fear the questions that will come from their children. So why did this happen? Why were these people treated differently? And again, if you're bringing in these narratives and perspectives, they will understand not everybody is accepting, not everyone is loving, and not everyone's going to embrace one another, that there are horrible things that happen. And it's bad enough that those things are happening, but when good people stand by and watch them happen, it's worse. Because that's allowing those things to happen. So like I said, we were learning about the Holocaust, and again, it was, one of the documentaries was a survivor who goes back to Auschwitz and talks about her experience as a Jewish person. And it was really hard, but I think it was really important to talk about, because one of the things she discussed was that as soon as they got to Auschwitz, they were separated, men and women, children, all that, but the children were immediately sent to the gas chamber. And I had to explain to my kids what the gas chamber was, and that was hard. I'm not gonna lie that it wasn't hard. My 7-year-old made the realization that if she was in that situation, she would have been killed simply for being the person she was, because she would have been a Jewish child at that time. And that's a really important connection to make, because these are things that happen to children. And I think you need to be respectful and validate their stories, that they're important in history. Yeah, was it really hard? But ignoring it is not the answer. And of course I made the connection, because like I said, I had a very narrow perspective of history. So relearning a lot of this information. The last time I learned this information or really dived deep into it was probably 20 years ago. And now I'm seeing it as an adult with children. So it's affecting me in a much different way. So for example, we were reading the Hannah Suitcase, we watched the documentary, and then we went into the dropping of the atomic bombs, and we watched a documentary on that. We read Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes, and it was interesting because I've read this book before. I read it in school when I was younger. And when we got to the end of the book, I actually just started bawling. And I think it was just a combination of, the last few weeks talking about some really hard subjects, that it really brought out some emotion in me. And again, I think this is really good to talk about with your children. I see so many people using the social emotional workbooks and things, but this is like real life social emotional you're learning. So I stopped, obviously, because I was upset, and I talked to my kids about why I was feeling upset and what was going on with me and how it impacts me to hear these stories and how I see them not as a child anymore, but I see them as an adult, and that this happened to children. It could happen to my children. That realization. So it's not just laying the information down there and walking away. It leads to a lot of discussion and deeper thinking, and honestly it makes a lot of people uncomfortable because it does bring up questions. It does bring up parts of yourself that you're not necessarily used to accessing. So really looking at your own bias and the institutions that created that bias. So the way I kind of see it is homeschooling is this safe environment to really explore these hard feelings together, to let them know it's okay to feel these emotions, that this is normal, and not to avoid it because it's difficult or because it makes us uncomfortable. But I see it this way, that if I had been given access to this information from a child's age and on, my perspective on life would have been different. I would have been able to more clearly see that people were treated differently and not have such an arrogant point of view that, oh, my life was rough too. I grew up in a household that was very, it's hard, get up, keep going type thing. But knowing that people have different hardships just because of who they are is foundational information for how you view this world, your perspective on life. So if I had been able to actually have that environment, that safe environment to really explore these feelings and the different situations that happen in history, how would that have impacted me as an adult? Instead, I'm now in my late 30s relearning these things. And I'm really looking forward to see what kind of people my children become because we've talked about these things. I put up a video recently about my homeschool wins, about how I'm starting to see in my 11-year-old this, of course, compassion and empathy, but her ability to see both sides of a situation, that it's not about her opinion, it's about listening to others. And that is, I think, one of the most important things we can pull from history, to not repeat the past, to learn from our mistakes. But if we don't talk about those mistakes in a really honest and raw way, then they're not going to know how to repeat them. Which brings me to the next one, which is the third one. A lot of people think that, well, it'll just give such a negative view on history. And like I said, if you're learning about hard thing after hard thing, it'll just be so overwhelming. I think how I focus on this, because we've spent an entire year going over the U.S. history with freedom, and there's a lot of discrimination and hatred being talked about, but you're also talking about people that persevere through these experiences. And it's intense, yes. And I don't think it's just, you should pull a person's biography, learn about what they overcame. No, you really need to deep dive into the context of the time and what this person, their life. It's not just reading a simple, who was this person book. It's so much more to that there are people that survived these horrific experiences. And the fact that they're still here and trying to tell us about it is really important. And the amount of courage that takes is a testament to humanity. It really is. So it's more than just reading the text and getting it done. These are the things you can't measure on standardized tests. These are the things that are impacting who you are and who you are meant to become. So there's two things I always do when we're talking about difficult subjects or difficult topics in history. When we're done, I always have a discussion with my kids. I never just leave it with the information that was. And one of the things I always say is, why are we learning about this? Why are we learning about this hard topic? Why are we diving deep into this? And it's so my kids have a better perspective, that they understand that people suffer for just being who they are. But also, number two, which I think is really important, what can we do about it? I think it's easy to feel helpless in these situations, and that's what people really don't like, that these horrible things are happening, and we can't do anything about it. And especially as a child, they must feel so powerless in the situation. You can give power to your children by, again, looking at what can we do. One of those things we can do is educate our children on the problems of this world, so that they are equipped, when they are adults, of course, to take on these problems, to end, systematic racism in our institutions, to deconstruct the institutions that were created to uphold certain people, but also as children. When they see someone being treated differently, don't tell me it doesn't happen, because I've seen it firsthand happen in a playground setting. People are treated differently. Children are treated differently by both other children and adults. And having my children be able to recognize those things, so they cannot be one of those silent people that says, well, this doesn't really affect me, or this has nothing to do with me, so I'm just going to ignore it. I'm going to bury my head in the sand because it's, not affecting me. No, the silence. Silence is a really important thing. Learning to stand up for what is right is something that children absolutely need to be taught. And not just standing up for things that affect them, but realizing there are others out there and they are equally as important as you. So those are two of the things I always talk about. So we have this really big discussion at the end about why we're learning about this, the importance of this, how it affects right now, and then what can we do? And what can we go out there and change? Or what can we physically do to help with these situations, to really put that power in their court that you can't change a lot, but you can change how you react to something, and you can change your impact. So that's really powerful in itself. One of the things I often hear as well, especially with you as history, that if we only focus on the negative parts, so of course people assume the negative parts are the parts of, the minority groups and their experience in United States history, because, you can't throw a stone in United States history without hearing massacre, genocide, and yes, my kids know what both those words mean. But I think standing up and talking about these important things, learning about social justice issues, about accurate history, and the struggles that certain people have is really important. And it is a very American thing to do, because in our Declaration of Independence, it talks about, all men are created equal. We have the right, unalienable rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That means everyone. So we are really being called to stand up for these people, and not just be people that look like us or think like us, but everybody. And I think one of the biggest things that our history has taught us over the years is that it's not just about my kids. It's not just about them. It's about everyone. And I think that's a really important thing to talk about, because I think we are a very me society, and always thinking about, well, that, I don't agree with that, it doesn't affect me, I shouldn't have to deal with it. That's not going to help us in the long run. I care what happens to my children. I care what happens to other people's children. I care what happens to everybody. This isn't just a fight about me. It's a fight for everybody. And I really want my children to understand that perspective on life and the world, and that they have the power to really impact change. Because whether we like it or not, the children are going to be the future. And if we provide them with an education, a really strong foundation about some of the mistakes, the problems in this world, they will be better equipped to handle and address and hopefully fix some of those problems, so the next generation is better. And then the next generation after that is better, and we can really end generational ignorance in this area. So that is kind of how I view the harder topics of history. That's kind of how I've handled it. And like I've said, my kids, I've really seen that personal growth, and especially my oldest, but also my 7-year-old, being able to make those connections of this is what happened and this is why this person was treated this way and how that's wrong. I'm seeing those connections. Since again, it's not something measurable on a standardized test or a chapter test, but this is the growth of the individual, which I think is really important. I think it's one of the ways history really teaches us. So if you have any specific questions, leave them in the comments below. If not, thank you for watching.